So hello.
Hello.
Nice to see all of you here and nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. My name is Robin Goldman and I'm an assistant scientist and co-scientific director at the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. And I'm here to speak with you tonight about the neurobiology of well-being and how it can be trained. So, at the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, we are led by Dr. Richard Davidson. While he certainly is a part of everything we do, so are a great number of other scientists and postdocs, graduate students, and scientific staff. In fact, I think at this point we have probably a total of 70-some folk working with us, plus some number of hundreds of undergrads that help us do what we do every semester. And none of this could be done without all of these people. So I just want to give thanks to all of them. And we're all working together under this mission here to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind. So, currently, like I said, we're working on many things, dozens of projects we're working on. And I'm going to tell you about some specifically tonight to really try and get into understanding two main questions that we have. One of them is what factors influence well-being? And the other is, can well-being be trained? So Bassam was talking before about how we used to think that once you became an adult, your brain was your brain and that was it. And now we know that that's not true. We know that new neurons grow, we know that synapses grow, that your brain actually can change. So is there a way that we can understand more about how this works, and specifically if we can harness that to cultivate or train well-being? So I'll start with what factors influence well-being. And we in the lab put a lot of attention actually to emotion. A lot of the work going on in the lab in some way, shape, or form has to do with emotion. So I'm going to focus on that tonight. And on both positive emotion and negative emotion. So we'll start with the positive. And what you see here, I'll walk you through. It's two different ways that we can conceive of people responding to something positive. So if we were to show somebody something positive, say a picture of a happy baby here. Let's see, is this gonna, do you see my mouse? There we go. Oh, it's tiny, okay. Happy baby. And this here is time moving across the bottom. What you can see for two different people, and they're illustrated as person A in red and person B in blue, is that they have a different kind of response to this positive event. The person A in red has a sustained response over time. They're maintaining a positive response. The person in red also has a positive response, but as time goes on, their response falls off more. So they're not sustaining the positive emotion as long as the person in red. So the amplitude, or the amount of positive emotion that each of these people have, is different. Just a natural variation in the way that these people are responding, or even the same person at different points in time. So how do we study this in the lab? Well, there's a very common design that we use where we display different pictures to subjects. Positive things, of negative things, neutral things, like, for example, a happy baby. And we measure people's responses in different ways. So we can either measure behavioral responses. So how do you respond to this by saying if it's positive or negative, or in some way showing us with a behavior something about how you feel about this, this image. We can also measure different physiological changes in the body. So we can measure sweat response. We can measure changes in your facial muscles or in other muscles in the body that can tell us about ways that you're physiologically expressing this emotion, this response to the emotion. We can also measure it in the brain. So, how does your response to positive events affect your well-being? Well, we've done a study. Aaron Heller in the lab did a study where he did just that. He showed people this kind of series of images and looked at how people responded in the brain. And there's an area of the brain here called the striatum, which is related to reward processing. And let me orient you to what you're looking at here. We're looking at, again, that sustained response versus less of a sustained response. So as you go across this bottom axis here, moving more to the left, we're getting a more sustained positive response. And on the y-axis there, moving up is greater well-being. So what Aaron showed in these subjects was that there was a relationship in this part of the brain, the striatum, which again is related to reward processing, when people were seeing these positive images. When this part of the brain had more positive response, they showed greater well-being via a questionnaire that allows us to tap into that. So the longer that you can sustain a response to positive images, the more psychological well-being you're likely to have. So, can stress affect your ability to sustain positive emotion? I bet to many of you, if not all of you in this room, that's kind of a silly question. When you're stressed, it's probably harder to sustain positive emotion. But we can look at that with various measures. So marital stress is one that can have a very large impact. So we looked at marital stress on the ability to sustain these positive emotions. And the way that we did that was through measuring the psychophysiology. So you'll see this woman here has electrodes on her face. And they're in a very specific location on her face. This muscle right here, we can measure changes when you make sort of a frowning or furrowed brow. And here we can look at changes in smile. And actually we can see very subtle differences in people's changes in facial expression and measure very subtle changes in their emotional response in this way. So here we're going to look at positive emotion by looking at a decreased response in the frown muscle. So when these people were looking at, when they see a positive image, how much does this muscle actually relax? Okay? So again, I'm going to orient you a bit to what you're going to see. So we're going to look here on the y-axis is increased stress. So as people had more stress. And on the x, moving off to the left, this is less sustained positive response, so meaning more brow furrowing. Okay? And what these people showed was that the greater the marital stress they had, they weren't as able to sustain positive emotion. Just looking at these pictures, looking at these positive pictures. So what do we know so far? We know that well-being depends on your ability to sustain positive emotion, and that this ability can be affected by stress. So what about negative emotion? What about negative events? How does this affect your well-being? So we're going to go back to this figure, but now we're going to look at it in a different way. Now we're going to look at it in terms of the impact of negative emotion. So now we're going to show a negative image. We're going to show a spider or some other such thing. And now we're going to say, okay, what's the difference between person A and person B here? Here, person A in the red has a sustained response to negative, and person B in the blue is recovering more quickly from that negative response. So it's the reverse. So now what we're looking for is how quickly can people recover from a negative event? And we go back to the same study design. But now we're going to replace our happy baby with a negative image. And we're going to look at fear responses or responses to negative images. And see how an inability to recover from negative events affects well-being. Okay? And again, we're going to go to the brain. And we're going to look at a part of the brain called the amygdala. And this work was done by Brianna Schuyler, who is also in the lab and actually the other scientific co-director now in the lab. And here, what we're going to look at is how people responded to these negative images. And let's see if my mouse will show up here. We're going to look at this part right here. So this bar, this is time going across the bottom here. And this black bar here represents when we had that scary spider image shown to people. And this is the response of the signal in the brain that we can measure with the MRI. And we're looking at that here in this region of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala relates to fear processing, to orienting and attentional type things. And we're going to look at this. This here is people's initial response to the image. And this here, this area is what we're going to call recovery. How quickly do people recover from seeing this negative image? And what she found is if she broke subjects that she scanned up into two groups, people who were high in neuroticism in red and people who were low in neuroticism in blue, they showed a different pattern in this recovery. So slower recovery, these people in the red, the higher neurotic people, is associated with greater neuroticism. Okay? So people who have a harder time or slower time recovering were also the people who were more neurotic. People who were less neurotic were the people who recovered more quickly. So can anything affect your ability to recover from negative emotion? We have also looked at different kinds of measures of well-being. So here, we looked at something called an eye blink response or startle response. And this work was done by Stacy Schaefer in the lab. And what she did was look at the startle response to negative images. So looking at eye blink magnitude, because when you are more stressed, your eye blink tends to be, you tend to startle more easily. You've probably noticed this when you're walking down the street and maybe not having a difficult day, and you hear a horn, you'll jump a little higher than if you were having a good day. So this is what she's measuring with this eye blink. So again, let me orient you here. What we're going to look at here on the x-axis as we move to the left is people who have greater purpose in life. So these people were asked all kinds of questions about their purpose in life, and people who reported having a greater purpose in life, we're going to look at how that relates to this to this startle. So here, as we go down the y-axis, people are having a faster recovery from seeing this from this negative event. So people down here will have a faster recovery, going along this way, greater purpose in life. And what she found was that there was a relationship between these two things. So people who reported having greater purpose in life had a faster recovery from negative events. Greater purpose in life associated with faster recovery from negative events. Okay, so what do we know thus far? We know that well-being depends on your ability to sustain positive emotion and recover from negative emotion, and that both can be affected by lifestyle or by things happening in your life. So now let's look at if these can be trained. Richie has a bit of a history with this and working with some folks who maybe are considered to be experts in specific types of training. This is with the Dalai Lama. And we've looked at folks who dedicate their lives to training in meditation. We've put them in MRI scanners, we've put electrodes on their head. So what do we find when we look at them? So Antoine Lutz did a study where he looked at expert meditators. Now, these experts are folks who have spent hours and hours and hours practicing. So the data that I'm about to show you, there was a range of practice that these people had. The minimum was 10,000 hours, which is about 10 hours of practice a day for 3 years. And the maximum was 50,000 hours. And for that person, it was 10 hours a day for 3 years and 5 hours a day for an additional 20 years. That's a lot of practice. So we hope if we're going to see changes in people's brains, we should be able to see changes in these people, because these are like Olympians of this type of practice. So what he looked at was something called gamma oscillations, which you can measure with electrodes that you put on someone's head, looking at the electrical changes going on in the brain. And gamma, which is relatively higher, faster frequency, is related to higher levels of attentional focus. So in these experts, compared to non-meditator controls, which you see here, they had a lot more of this gamma activity. So each of these numbers are an individual person. So we can see even in the experts, there's a lot of variability there in how much they show, but they all show more of this gamma activity. So what does that look like? Well, this here is what those EEG squiggles look like when this one particular expert was just relaxing, sitting there, not meditating. And then this is when he started meditating, just to give you an idea of the kind of thing that we're seeing here. Okay, so long-term attention and compassion meditation practice can alter brain, what we can see in the brain. Okay, great. But none of us are huge experts. It would be good to know if in these people we can see a change in their emotional response. Or in other people practicing meditation. What kind of, it's fine if it changes squiggles in the brain, but what does that mean? How does that translate then into something that would have an impact? So let's go back to that study design that we've used a lot in the lab, where we're looking at people's responses to positive and negative pictures. And again, just to remind you of what we're looking for here, Now we're going to look again at people's response to negative images. And we're looking at the difference over time in how people recover to these negative images. Do they recover more quickly, like in the blue? Or do they have a sustained response to the negative, like in the red? So again, we looked in the amygdala. And here, in this study, we looked in long-term meditators, not expert meditators. So what does that mean? These people were not people who dedicated their lives to meditation. They weren't monks. They were people in the United States who dedicated a lot of time to meditation, but still lived in the US, went to the grocery store, did all these kinds of things. So these people, they practiced, the minimum was about 1,500 hours. So that was, for this person, it was 1 hour a day for 4 years. Okay, that sounds doable. And then 32,000 hours, which was 10 hours a day for 3 years, and 3 hours a day for 20 years. But a range in between there. So let's look at what that looked like. So in red, we've got the long-term meditators that I was telling you about. And in blue, we've got folks who've never practiced meditation before. So what do you notice? It's the same. So now you're probably thinking, why is she showing me this if it's the same? Well, we looked at this and we thought the same thing. Why aren't we seeing a difference here? So we decided that what we would do is just look at the long-term meditators. And now we're just going to look at, we're going to break the long-term meditators up into the folks who have a lot of practice and the folks who have a little practice. So the least practice in this group of long-term meditators is in green, and the most practice is in purple. And now you see a difference. So in this group of meditators that we studied, the folks with less practice had more of a sustained response to these negative images, and the folks with more practice had a quicker recovery. So what might this mean? Well, could mean any number of things. One way to really try to investigate this more, and we're headed that direction, is to start studying people over time, over longer periods of time. So what was it that drew these people to meditation in the first place? Well, in the US, it's very possible that somebody who dedicated that much time to meditation needed some help with something. Maybe they started off worse off and were looking for something to help them out. I think that's probably a lot of why people in our culture are drawn to meditation. You start doing it because you're stressed, because you're having a hard time. So we need to look into it more. But it does look like the more practice these people do, the easier time they have recovering from negative things. So the more hours of practice they have, that's associated with faster recovery from negative events. So what do we know so far? We know that well-being is associated with sustained positive emotion and quick recovery from negative. And we know that emotional response can be affected by life circumstances. So it's not set in stone. And that mental training, meditation as a form of mental training, is a way to alter emotional response. But what about if we don't have 10,000 hours to give? It's probably pretty much everyone in this room. Maybe not. Let's say most everyone in this room, including me. I don't have 10,000 hours to give. So what about for me? Can short-term training affect the brain? Well, Helen Wang in the lab looked at exactly that. She looked at a particular type of meditation training called compassion training. And she looked at compassion meditation compared to cognitive reappraisal. Let me give you an example of what that is. Compassion meditation training, these people spent 2 weeks training for 30 minutes a day. And they did a guided compassion meditation, which actually, if you're curious, you can go to the website, which I'll show you at the end, and you can hear it. And in this meditation, you imagine someone that you know, and you say some phrases towards them. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be free from harm, these kinds of things. And then you work through to people you don't really know, to people you don't really like. You do this every day for 30 minutes. And then she had another group that did a similar type of thing, but they were learning cognitive reappraisal. So what does that mean? That means you see the crying baby, and you think, well, the baby's mom is going to come soon, or the baby's dad, and it's going to get fed, and everything's going to be fine. So really, it's not so bad. Something like that is cognitive reappraisal. So what did she find? What she did was, after people went through this training, she had them play a game. And in this game, it basically measures how likely people are to share or to redistribute money. So it's a little gambling type game where you can see how likely someone is to make the money that's being given more equal across people, or to give money that could have gone to them to someone else. And what she found was that in the compassion group, they were more likely to share. So these are the folks who went through the compassion training than the folks who went through this reappraisal. But she also found changes in the brain. So she did this in an MRI scanner. And this part of the brain here is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain is related to goal-directed behavior. Goal-directed attention, sustaining positive things. Other studies have found relations there on those types of tasks. So what did she find? Let me orient you again to this. So now moving to the left, we're going to have greater brain activity in this area. And going up, we're going to have more redistribution, or more pro-social, more sharing. And what you're going to see is the difference between these two training groups. Oop, wrong direction. So here, in red, is the group who learned compassion. And just look at the red line there. The red line is the fit, or the average of each subject. And the red line, so these are the folks who did the compassion training, when they have greater activity in this part of their brain, they are sharing more. The other group, who did a different kind of training, goes the other way. So the trainings had different effect on the brain in these people. People who went through the compassion training were more likely to share, and we can see that in this part of the brain. So participants who completed the compassion training show greater activity in this part of the brain when they engage in more pro-social or more sharing behavior. So a person's emotional response can be altered by long-term meditation practice, and it can also be impacted by short-term training. So short trainings we can also see changes in people's behavior and in the brain. So great. Can we make it kind of fun to do this? Well, we're looking at that too. So one way that we've been looking at that is looking at games to promote pro-social behavior and well-being, or attention, training of attention in kids. And we've built in collaboration with the Games and Learning Society here at UW. We've built a couple of iPad games. And we've done a lot of testing of these games, and now piloting of these games and testing of these games in adolescents. We've also looked at it in folks maybe with a little more practice with meditation. So what are the games? We've got one game called Crystals of Cador. And in this game, we are training pro-social behavior. We have images of aliens that you can read the emotions of. And I've got a little video here to give you a bit more of an example. Let's see if this works.
Sentient life is detected on the distant planet Kador. A spacecraft containing 4 robotic explorers is sent to investigate.
Can you hear it?
Their primary mission will be to study the alien culture through the interpretation of basic emotions.
So the person playing the game is
The spacecraft begins its long journey
a
to
robot.
Kador.
And their mission is to go out, and suddenly here they are on this spaceship, and they're about to land on the planet Kador. Here they go. Off goes the pod. And we tried to make this game something that would actually be fun for kids to play, that would be appealing to them. So you crash land on this planet, and what you need to do is go around and find all the various parts that you've lost in order to be able to leave again. And to do that, you have to understand the facial emotions of these aliens and make friends with them and try and do things to befriend and engage these aliens. And kids seem to like playing it. So here they're trying to say what an emotion is and also how intense it is, to be able to read intensity of emotion. And we have another game as well called Tenacity, which is more of an attention training game. And here it's a focus on breath awareness and attention to the breath. And they tap the screen and count their breath up to 10 and then start again. And they, for correct counting, flowers grow on the screen and various things happen. So we're also looking at ways to train these kinds of behaviors in school-age kids in young preschool. And we've been working on a kindness curriculum, which we've done a number of studies on now, preliminary studies. And we use various books that deal with emotion and attention. We have a curriculum that's based on the ABCs. So attention, breath, caring practice, interdependence, emotions, forgiveness, and gratitude. We use different objects to help the kids. This is a mind jar, so it's got little sparklies in it. And if you shake it up, it's a snow globe. Shake it up and the sparkles go everywhere. And then the kids can watch the sparkles settle just like their mind will settle, that their minds will sometimes be chaotic, and then they can sit and watch it settle. And there are all kinds of little tools like that for teaching these kinds of things. So for kids aren't going to be, we're not going to be able to measure the changes in kids the way that we can in adults. So we've had to come up with all kinds of other ways to test the impact of these curriculum on kids. And one of the ways that we've done that in the young kids is through this little task they do with stickers. So they get a bunch of stickers in an envelope, and then they get to give some stickers. Keep some for themselves, give some to their friend, maybe give some to a kid they don't really like, to a stranger, to a sick kid. And we can look at how they change this giving behavior before and after the training. And what we've found is preliminarily, in the kids who go through this training, they're more likely to share than the kids who don't go through the training. We're now doing these kinds of studies in a much larger group of kids to really see what kinds of impact this curriculum has. So we have some hints that pro-social games and that these curriculum can increase pro-social behavior, can increase well-being in kids. But there's a lot left to do. So that's a good part of what we're doing right now. We're also doing these kinds of curriculum for adults. So we're now developing a curriculum, or have developed a preliminary curriculum in collaboration with the School of Business to teach a well-being curriculum in the workplace. And so in this particular curriculum, we'll be delivering it in various places of work and looking at impact both on individual well-being, on changes in people's calling in sick, on productivity, all kinds of things like that. And as part of this too, we're realizing that we don't have great ways to measure changes in people's well-being. So another aspect of this project is trying to develop new ways, just like we did with the kids, with the sticker redistribution. Are there new ways that we can measure well-being and changes in well-being, other than somebody just saying, yeah, I feel better, yeah, I feel worse, which people aren't always so accurate at reporting. So what have I told you today? Well-being is associated with sustained positive emotion and quick recovery from negative emotion. And this emotional response is affected by life circumstances, so it's not set in stone. So that's great news. If it's not set in stone, then we can train it. We can use various practices, various curriculum, various different types of trainings to train well-being, to cultivate well-being. And so what we're now trying to do is understand really how can we train well-being in children and adults with curriculum, with video games, with other things. So stay tuned. So thanks to all of you for listening, to Bassam for having me, to the scientists and the grad students and scientific staff, all of the development staff that we have. If you would like more information, we've got many more studies that you can get more information about on our website. And like I said, we also have some of the trainings that we've done. We've got the compassion meditation. We've got I think we also have the breath awareness, the tenacity game, that a version of that you can try. So we've barely scratched the surface tonight, but thank you very much for being here and for listening. And let me know if you have any questions.